First of all, thanks so much for having me, and it's almost surreal for me to be speaking here, because I remember when I first started studying this stuff, and I was like 11 or 12, and I just became obsessed with it. I was reading these guys' work and reading their books, and now I'm on the same panel with them, so it's an honor. So today we're going to be talking about terrorism and human rights and how you balance both. Now, every single country has that struggle of how do you crack down on terrorism, particularly the extremism that drives it, while also respecting civil liberties. And each country's balance of that is going to be different. Egypt's a particularly difficult situation because if you look at how the Islamist atmosphere is sustained, it is through civil society. It is through entities like the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas that are backed by Turkey and Qatar, and is also influenced by the Salafists that are backed by Saudi Arabia and Qatar as well. And so it becomes very difficult in a non-democratic country to say exactly where that line is drawn. If you have to crush certain elements of operations that are operating through civil society, how do you do that in such a way that then protects the more moderate and minority elements of that society? So that's something that I'm going to be throwing out some different thoughts based on my recent short trip to Egypt from earlier this year, from which I came back understanding a greater gray area than I anticipated. The situation was confusing with a lot of questions before, and then it became a lot more confusing with a lot more of a gray area. But to answer the question of what's something that you can do, the group that I work for, the Clarion Project, does have a new film out called Faith Keepers. It's all about the persecution of Christians and other minorities in the Middle East, Egypt being obviously a key focus of it. And so we have the trailer, and this is something that churches and even synagogues and maybe even some mosques are going to be showing. So this is something, if you're looking to awaken the church, and I believe that the church is not awakened, not investing effort, they know that this is going on but are not being given an action item, well, this is a good way to start that conversation. So we can play the trailer now.
The current status of Christians and other non-Muslim minorities throughout the Middle East is the worst it's been in centuries.
21 people were killed when a powerful bomb exploded in front of a Coptic Christian church.
Muslim mobs began attacking Christian churches.
They are targeting churches, temples, cultural and historical sites.
سوريا وأنا لم خرجت شو سوريا والعراق قتلوا خلي.
يعني ضغطوني بالقوة اختصموني وتقريبا 4 أيام 5 أيام رجعت لي البيت. هو كان بسيارته راجع من الشغلة لزموا ايده ورجله وريدوا لي قطع راسه.
I converted from Islam to Christianity. I was arrested, and after that they gave me a death penalty. What I told the judge in this day, if loving and worshiping Christ is a crime, I'm guilty as charged.
The Christians of Iraq and Syria who fled ISIS narrowly escaped a genocidal campaign of mass murder, of crucifixions, and of beheadings.
Now we are here in our center for youth. We have here 186 caravans, 260 families here.
What is taking place in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq, is genocide.
They call this ethnic cleansing. This is the real word.
The administration is failing, the Congress is failing, and quite frankly, with all due respect, the church is failing.
In response to persecution, I always want to tell people to pray. Stop, pray. Be burdened for your brother and sister, but get involved in the fight and help.
And doesn't matter how small is your voice, you can make a difference, even if you are just one person.
So you can find out how to set up a screening by going to clarionproject.org. By the way, my email address is ryan@clarionproject.org if you want to contact me, and I forget to give you my card or whatever. So ryan@clarionproject.org. The name of the film is Faith Keepers. You can find it on Facebook or whatever, Google, and it'll pop right up. Now, one of the first things that surprised me when I was in Egypt earlier this year was, first of all, how extroverted the society was. I mean, in the United States right now, if you say hi to a stranger, you come off like a creep. In Egypt, as soon as we go out there, we just had lines of people that want to talk to us in Cairo and in the area around the pyramid. So when 90% of our meetings were canceled, it was actually a blessing in disguise, because then we were just talking to people from all sorts of backgrounds, from Muslim Brotherhood supporters to people that didn't know much but were inclined towards Morsi just because he was elected in their minds, to strong Sisi supporters to people that were disappointed with him. And it was really fascinating. And what struck me was how freely they spoke. Now, no one's going to deny that human rights are being violated in Egypt, that people are being locked up left and right. You can take the most favorable attitude towards the Egyptian government, and those human rights reports aren't, if 1% of them is true, well, then he's a major human rights violator. But I don't know if it's because everyone's so opinionated or it was just limited to the geographic area I was in. People spoke freely, where there would be police officers around and someone would be just going off about how much they didn't like Sisi and how they wish that the government would resign. And so that was very interesting to see. And the opinions were very complicated, more complicated than you see in the United States, where if someone's a Republican, you kind of know what they're going to say. If someone's a Democrat, you know what they're going to say. If someone listens to Alex Jones, you know what they're going to say. And it wasn't like that in Egypt. It was much more diverse. But one of the commonalities I saw, and you would just know this from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, was a strong focus on security and economic progress, even far more so than freedom. If you would talk about freedom, I actually had one person right after saying how they want to have freedoms. I said, okay, so that's like your top priority. His response was, F your freedom. and the reason he was saying that was because he said, look, with bombs going off and the insecurity that we're dealing with and the economic issues that we're dealing with, those are the two priorities. The red line for a lot of Egyptians I spoke to was having limited freedoms. They want the ability to criticize the government, the ability to freely discuss things, have some protests with restrictions, use social media, and have some type of free elections. But in terms of getting a warrant before you go into someone's home and that type of thing, I saw a lot of popular support for saying just go into people's homes, arrest them if you think that they're a terrorist or an extremist. And those actions that may be criticized in the West seem to be very popular over there. One of the common criticisms I would see or hear often was also that Sisi wasn't strong enough. So we need a butcher, but we need someone that goes in there and cleans out the corruption. We have police that are abusing us. We have judges that are putting out orders like blasphemy laws and going after our free speech, and he doesn't do anything. So it was interesting to see those different types of criticism, some saying, oh, well, he's going too far in some respects, and then others saying, well, he's not going far enough in others in terms of shutting down dissent. One of the other interesting themes I came across, and I would say the majority of conversations would somehow track back to this, was always some level of a conspiracy theory. Whether it was a Zionist conspiracy, if someone was more Islamist inclined, that's what you would get. Or whether it was just a conspiracy against the state, against the country of Egypt that's very vague and can't be defined. Or sometimes it would be something involving Western companies. Or a New World Order, you would hear something like that. There's this pervasive sense that there's an abstract conspiracy against the state, and you identify those who are a part of it by them being overly hostile, consistently hostile, overly negative, never ever having anything positive to say. And I would see that across the political spectrum. And so if I was making a recommendation in terms of activism, you don't want to fall into that trap where someone says, okay, well, you are just hostile all the time, always negative, therefore you must be part of this conspiracy, and therefore, even if I agree with a lot of what you're saying, you are my adversary. And that's one of the damaging things that conspiracy theories bring around. So when you make your criticisms, if there is something positive to package it with, I do believe you'll be more effective. Another point I would make, and this was made earlier, is that absolutely you should stand up for the human rights of secular democratic forces. That in order for Egypt to move forward, you need those liberal voices to be heard. I once heard a quote from, I believe it was a Lebanese activist that was involved in different countries. And he was saying, look, under secular governments, yes, secular governments are preferable to elected Islamists. But under secular governments, you still have these radical environments growing. And why is that? And he said, because guys like me, secular liberals, and he identified as a Muslim, we have no space. We have no way to operate in the open, no ability to organize, whereas the Islamists in those environments can go to a mosque and raise money. They're not going to shut down the Friday prayers, the guest speakers coming in. That's a line that secular governments are not willing to cross. And so some people out there will say, well, the answer to all of this are secular strongmen. Drop democracy promotion, drop human rights promotions altogether. But when you look at the type of environment that creates, it's one that's actually favorable to the Islamists because it shuts down the competitors to the Islamists that can be popularly supported. So when we stand up for Coptic Christians, it's important that we also step up for those liberal elements that are being persecuted in Egypt. But when it's an Islamist extremist, is it worth hurting the U.S.-Egyptian relationship for them? Do we want to advocate for the rights of Islamic extremists that want to take those rights away? Yes, maybe their rights are being violated. Yes, it's in an ideal scenario, it's a threat to civil liberties. But if you have to pick your battles, I would rather pick the battles on the side of genuine moderates than on the side of Muslim Brotherhood type elements where you're not going to make any progress anyway. One of the disturbing observations I made was that I met with a true secular liberal human rights activist. And the human rights activists that you would talk to, they would be more hostile to CC than your average person who's focused on security and economic improvements. But the political activists, even though they did not like Islamists, the one guy showed up with a Muslim Brotherhood activist. He knew I was interested, but this was a close friend of his. I believe he might have even said he was related to Morsi or a family member of Morsi's family. And so we have a dangerous combination happening, where you have secular democratic activists who don't really share anything in common with the Islamists, but are again uniting. And that's how Islamists often come to power, how they cause a lot of troubles, because they align with those that are not like them but are willing to align with them. So that makes it all the more important that you identify those non-Islamist opponents of the Egyptian government, you ally with them, but you do so in a pragmatic way. One example that you could raise up would be King Abdullah in Jordan. I remember there was a point in recent years where the protests were gearing up against him. They included the more secular elements and it included the Muslim Brotherhood. And we all started looking at it and saying, okay, it looks like Jordan's going to be the next to have upheaval. And the King of Jordan met with the secular liberal opponents of his and marginalized the Islamists who were planning protests. As a result of that and having concessions, he was able to build a bond, come to the middle ground with some of his more liberal opponents. The Islamists were left out in the cold and their protests failed. Now that's in the interest of the government that you're criticizing and the interest of yourselves. And that's a formula that can work. One of the other problems, and Egyptian government officials in a private setting will admit this to you, is that when it comes to human rights and combating extremism, sometimes there's too much of a focus on CC as an individual. You're dealing with institutional problems. Decades and decades of security services, of judges, of all those people in power acting either out of authoritarianism, corruption, or Islamic extremism. So you could take the perspective that CC is a genuine reformer, and I'll talk a little bit more about my feelings on that. But then you still up against institutions that are going to be unleashing blasphemy laws, enforcing them, and doing horrible things. And how do you take them on? And particularly, how do you take them on while then saying, well, I'm moving in a pro-human rights direction, but then if you're abolishing these institutions and the court systems, that puts you in a very tough spot. And Egyptian government officials will say to you, and I believe this is genuine, that on issues where they have to take on judges, they're afraid to do so. Because the popular unrest over Morsi skyrocketed after he said, basically, the judges don't matter. I am the dictator. I don't like them. I consider their rulings to be invalid, unless I agree with them. And that's a line that government officials are terrified to cross. So what they will advocate, and you can decide for yourself whether this is sheer propaganda or whether there's some truth to it, it's essentially reverse gradualism. Gradualism being the Islamist doctrine that says you incrementally implement Sharia law to the point where you can take over, and then you incrementally implement it so that you don't get ahead of yourself and end up becoming counterproductive. So what Egyptian government officials and their supporters will say that this is essentially reverse gradualism. So what's the first order of business? Dismantling terrorist networks. The Muslim Brotherhood, their affiliates, the Salafi jihadis, ISIS and Hamas in Sinai, that's a lot to take on, and the Egyptian government is having a very difficult time doing so. And I think everyone agrees that that part is genuine. Those are people trying to overthrow Sisi, so he's trying to fight them. And it's very difficult. So then what about the Salafists? An argument can be made that from a pragmatic standpoint, can he really take on ISIS, Hamas in Sinai, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Salafists all at once? Is he powerful enough to do that? Is that the wisest strategy to do? And so what they will say is, well, we've got to go after those that are setting off the bombs right now, and we split the Salafists. There are some that support Sisi, there are others that say those guys are sellouts. And what you're seeing happen in the state media that is regulated by the Egyptian government, you are seeing criticism of Salafism. And when they crack down on the unregistered mosques, there's 27,000 of them, Salafists went wild because it was their mosques. And so when it comes to Salafism, what an Egyptian government advocate would say is that there is an ideological attack on them, even if it's not going in and destroying their networks, and it's within what they're capable of doing. The messaging is explicitly anti-Salafist, some of the things that Sisi is saying. I went to a Salafist online school. I know what they teach. The things he is saying is not compatible and in fact strikes at some of the core of what they teach. He has said that we need to renew interpretations that have been frozen over 800 years. Salafism is based on the fact that we stick to those. He's criticized the Muslim Brotherhood for wanting, quote, an Islamic religious empire. He says that Islam favors, quote, a civil state over an Islamic state. Openly says to separate politics from religion. Now that may be a PR move. I'm not going to say I'm a mind reader. But what that means is that, at least from a messaging standpoint, he is clashing with the Salafists. And if it's all fake, that alliance is going to break at some point. Those two views are too diametrically opposed that either Sisi's going to have to stop and then they reconcile, or there's going to be a big break. And Sisi has made it clear that we're to judge him by those benchmarks. When he says these statements, it's not just in response to a criticism in an interview for Western ears. If you put a Google alert of Sisi's name, you'll see this is inserted into every speech he makes almost. And so if it was just about PR, you wouldn't want to say, here's a benchmark that I do not intend to meet. That would be politically suicidal. So I think he's genuine in wanting to advance interpretations in a certain direction. The question is, how far? Will it be to a degree that we are acceptable? Will he only go half of what he's talking about and then be deterred by craving for his own power? And those are questions that we simply don't know. Some other things in recent Egyptian news that you may or may not know about. The Ministry of Religious Endowments has put together a 5-year guideline basically telling the mosques that register with the Egyptian government what they can preach about, what they're to discuss. So they've already identified 156 topics to be discussed for the rest of this year, 270 over the next 5. They're registering mosques, certifying clerics, centralizing control. They have a committee that includes more than just religious leaders. It includes scientists, scholars, psychologists, social scientists to reform religious dialogue. I think that's incredible. To put together a committee to reform religious dialogue and these interpretations that includes non-religious leaders, and just inserting that type of messaging and action into the conversation is something that we have longed for a long time. And so on the final point, can that work? What level of success can we expect, even if we're disappointed with Sisi, but he moves some of the dialogue and some of the culture in a more positive direction? Well, his model is similar to, might be similar to what was referred to as official Islam under the Soviet Union and the Muslim republics there. That was something I studied in school, and what they would do is they would limit mosque construction. They all had to be registered and approved by the government. Sermon content was controlled. There was a highly nationalistic tone to the sermons. They could not be political at all. And you wouldn't think that this would work, because it's so diametrically opposed to how mainstream Islam has been taught. But if you look at the polls today in Central Asia, you'll see widespread support for the foundations of democracy, even if the countries are not democratic. If you look at polls about whether they want Sharia to be the law of the land, very tiny percentage. How much influence religious leadership have over politics? In these countries, it's very low. So there's some reason to believe that this centralization of the religious establishment has some room for success based on official Islam in Central Asia, which was done by the communists. And every Muslim that went to one of those mosques knew they were getting communist-approved propaganda, but still somehow it changed the culture and it changed the discussion. You can see that in the polls today, assuming the polls are accurate.